The story of Dionysius the Areopagite is one that hovers between history and legend, truth and myth, and it carries with it the haunting weight of torture, faith, and political warning. To understand why his fate became so significant, one has to return to the earliest days of Christianity, days when the message of Paul and his companions was not just radical but dangerous. Dionysius, according to early Christian tradition, was an Athenian judge, a man of law and philosophy who found himself moved by the teachings of Paul. When the apostle came to preach at the Areopagus, the great court of Athens, among the scoffing philosophers and skeptical thinkers, Dionysius was one of the very few who believed. That moment of conversion is considered the beginning of a path that would ultimately lead him to his brutal and mysterious end. From Athens, his role grew. He is remembered as one of the first converts in the city, eventually leaving behind the world of Greco-Roman philosophy to embrace the calling of bishop and missionary. Later medieval sources expanded his life far beyond Athens, painting him as the first bishop of Paris, a man whose faith was carried into the heart of Gaul. Yet, within the folds of tradition, another story emerged, one far more harrowing and drenched in blood. This story placed him not in the safer grounds of France, but in the perilous East, where the Persian Empire held sway, and where the persecution of Christians was both common and severe. Persia was a land of ancient kingdoms, powerful rulers, and rigid systems of faith. Zoroastrianism was the state religion, guarded fiercely by priests and kings who viewed foreign religions as threats to the cosmic order. Christianity, arriving through missionaries, was particularly unsettling. It carried with it not only foreign gods, but also loyalty to a faith that often clashed with imperial rule. For the Persian kings, Christianity could be a whisper of rebellion, a sign of Rome's influence creeping across their borders. Thus, when Dionysius is said to have traveled east, it was into this tense and hostile environment that he carried his cross. The story claims that Dionysius continued preaching, drawing small groups of converts despite the ever-present risk. His voice was one of defiance against the religious and political authority of Persia. To the Zoroastrian priesthood and the king himself, such acts were intolerable, and so the order was given: silence him, not merely by death, but by a death that would echo. Crucifixion was chosen, not only for its cruelty, but for its symbolism. Crucifixion was not a common punishment in Persia. It was foreign, humiliating, and agonizing. To take a bishop, a man believed to be a leader of the Christian faith, and subject him to such a punishment was not just execution, it was a statement. The image of Dionysius raised on a cross in a Persian city would have been terrifying to his followers. It showed that no Christian, no matter how holy, could escape the reach of the king. It reminded them that their loyalty to their faith might demand the highest price, and it tied the story of Dionysius forever to that of his master, Jesus Christ, who himself had been crucified by imperial decree centuries earlier. In this mirroring of sufferings, the story takes on its almost mythic tone, a bishop crucified as a warning, his broken body serving as both terror and inspiration. But how much of this story is real, and how much is legend layered over centuries? That question lingers in the minds of historians. We know that Christian missionaries reached Persia early, and we know that persecution was often severe. The Persian kings, particularly under the Sasanian dynasty, viewed Christians with suspicion, especially during times of war with Rome, when they feared that believers might side with their Roman co-religionists. Bishops and priests were frequently imprisoned, tortured, and executed. The method of crucifixion, however, is far less common in Persian accounts, which has led some scholars to doubt its use here. Was Dionysius truly crucified, or was this detail added later to bind his story more closely to that of Christ? Regardless of whether the crucifixion itself happened, the tale carried immense weight. It was retold in sermons, in manuscripts, and in the memory of Christians who lived under constant threat. For them, Dionysius stood as a symbol of ultimate faithfulness, a man who refused to bow, even when faced with the most humiliating form of torture. And for those who heard his stories centuries later, in medieval France or beyond. The gruesome image of a bishop crucified in Persia reminded them of the global scope of Christian suffering, of how the cross reached far beyond Rome, into lands where faith was crushed beneath foreign thrones. Imagine the moment. A bishop rode in the vestments of his office, stripped and beaten by soldiers who had no respect for his faith. The cross raised not outside Jerusalem, but in a Persian city, that would set into the earth as a crowd gathered to watch. Perhaps his followers stood hidden among the spectators, tears streaming as they witnessed the agony of their teacher. Perhaps the priests of Zoroaster looked on with grim satisfaction, their enemies silenced in blood. And perhaps the king, seated in his throne or represented by his soldiers, considered the act of final warning, the price of defiance, the cost of loyalty to a foreign god. In this image, we see the blending of fact and symbol. Whether Dionysius himself endured this fate, or whether it was the fate of another martyr whose story became attached to his name, the power of the narrative is undeniable. Crucifixion was not simply death, it was prolonged torment. Nails driven through hands and feet, the body sagging under its own weight, breath becoming shallow as hours turned into an unrelenting struggle. For the bishop to endure this, publicly and painfully, was meant to crush not only his life but the spirit of all who followed him. And yet, as the story spread, the opposite happened. His martyrdom inspired courage, faith, and resistance. His suffering became a torch that carried the message further, not extinguished by death, but ignited by it. This is the paradox of martyrdom. The Persian king may have hoped to kill a leader and intimidate his followers, but by crucifying Dionysius, he created a legend. And legends are harder to silence than living men. They travel, they inspire, they shape memory long after the bones have turned to dust. The tortured bishop became not merely a victim, but a symbol, one that straddled east and west, myth and history. And his crucifixion, whether literal or symbolic, remains one of the darkest examples of how torture was wielded not only to punish, but to broadcast power. The execution of Dionysius, whether grounded in fact or magnified by legend, reveals the raw edge of early Christianity's clash with political power. In the Persian mind, crucifying a bishop was no ordinary act, it was a performance of dominance. The cross itself, already a feared symbol of Roman cruelty, was inverted into a political message: resist the state, and your faith will not save you. By elevating Dionysius on the wooden beams, exposed to the public gaze, the Persians weren't just punishing a man, they were staging a warning, meant to echo across borders and through time. Accounts describe his suffering as prolonged and humiliating. Bound and nailed, his body suspended, Dionysius endured both the physical torment of crucifixion and the psychological agony of becoming a spectacle. Some traditions claim that as he hung, he recited prayers and urged fellow Christians not to abandon their faith, turning his punishment into a final sermon. To his captors, it was a display of submission. To his followers, it was the ultimate act of defiance. Death on a cross had once silenced men, but now it risked transforming them into martyrs whose voices carry further in death than in life. This paradox was not lost on the authorities. They wanted to break the resolve of believers. Yet every crucifixion threatened to plant the seeds of reverence. The very act of nailing Dionysius to the wood, intended as suppression, transformed him into a symbol. Over time, stories of his death blurred the line between fact and sacred legend. In medieval retellings, his crucifixion became less about one bishop and more about the archetype of a Christian leader, standing firm against worldly kings. The history was reshaped into theology, a story not of a man crushed, but of a soul exalted. Later traditions, especially in France, further embroidered Dionysius's tale. He was remembered not just as the bishop of Paris, but as a saint whose endurance testified to the universal struggle of Christians against hostile empires. Some accounts merge his story with that of Saint Denis, the patron of Paris, claiming miraculous events surrounding his execution. In these narratives, his crucifixion is not an end, but a passage into eternal honor. where his blood sanctified the soil and his body became a relic of defiance. Whether historically precise or not, the memory of his crucifixion was powerful enough to inspire devotion for centuries. What makes this story particularly haunting is its layered purpose. On one hand, it reflects the brutal realities of early Christian persecution under foreign rulers. On the other, it shows how history and myth merge to create a moral lesson. The crucifixion of Dionysius may never have unfolded exactly as later chronicles claimed, yet its persistence in Christian memory reveals how torture becomes more than just pain. It becomes a message, both for the oppressor and the oppressed. For the Persians, it was a symbol of power. For the Christians, a banner of resilience. When we consider Dionysius's fate within the broader context of Christian missions in hostile territories, it underscores the dangers of faith-driven journeys. Missionaries carried their beliefs across borders into lands with little tolerance for rival gods or doctrines. In those regions, to preach was to provoke, and to convert was to threaten the existing order. Dionysius's supposed crucifixion, then, embodies not just one man's death but the larger risk of challenging entrenched powers with spiritual conviction. The resonance of his story also lies in the method of his execution. Crucifixion is among the most dehumanizing forms of death, designed not simply to kill but to humiliate and terrorize. The body becomes both an example and an exhibit. For a bishop, a shepherd of his flock, to be subjected to it was an intentional insult to the Christian community. It suggested that not even their leaders could claim dignity under foreign rule. Yet paradoxically, the very humiliation amplified his significance. The cross, once an emblem of shame, became through such stories an emblem of endurance and faith. Centuries later, whether told in sermons, carved into church walls, or whispered among believers, the crucifixion of Dionysius carried a weight greater than mere history. It was a reminder of what it cost to bear witness to one's faith. It asked a timeless question: how much is one willing to endure for belief? For the early Christians, Dionysius's answer was carved in wood and sealed in blood. His suffering turned into testimony, his silence into a voice that echoed far beyond Persia's borders. As modern readers, we may question the historical precision of these accounts. Scholars debate whether Dionysius ever reached Persia, whether his death truly took the form of crucifixion, or whether medieval authors shaped the story to inspire courage. But regardless of the factual gaps, the legend persists because it speaks to something deeper than dates and places. It speaks to the endurance of faith under torture, the transformation of cruelty into meaning, and the way human stories are elevated into sacred myths. The tortured bishop, nailed to the beams of a cross, embodies a truth both grim and transcendent that power seeks to silence. Yet sometimes the act of silencing only makes the message louder. His story, whether fully true or partly legend, reminds us of the cost of conviction and the strange alchemy by which suffering becomes legacy. To the Persians, it was a warning. To the Christians, it was a victory of the spirit. The duality ensures that Dionysius's crucifixion, real or not, continues to haunt history. And so, as the centuries have passed, his crucifixion remains a symbol not only of faith under fire, but of the broader human struggle against tyranny. Stories like these survive because they capture the essence of defiance, the refusal to yield even when every nail drives deeper into flesh. Dionysius may have died on that cross, but the warning the Persians intended was transformed into a story of inspiration, a story that continues to echo in the chambers of history. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten tales of faith, torture, and resilience from history's darkest chapters. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Dionysius's crucifixion was fact, or was it legend crafted to inspire? Either way, his story remains a chilling reminder of the price of belief and the strange power of suffering to outlive death.